Ask most people to point to the Sea of Azov on a map and you'll get a lot of blank stares, and honestly, that's fair. It's a small, shallow, unremarkable body of water, wedged between occupied Crimea, occupied southern Ukraine, and the Russian mainland, the kind of place that never made headlines until the war made it impossible to ignore. For most of this conflict, it's been a quiet backwater compared to the front lines further north, but over the past couple of weeks, it's turned into one of the most consequential theaters of the entire war, and understanding why requires understanding what Russia actually built there once it took control. Russia seized the entire Azov coastline within months of the 2022 invasion, with the port city of Mariupol falling that May after a brutal months-long siege that leveled much of the city, including its steel industry. Losing that coastline was economically devastating for Ukraine. Researchers at Mariupol State University have estimated the country lost somewhere between 10 and 12% of its GDP in one stroke, and that figure may understate the real damage once you account for the destruction of the city's industrial base. Moscow, for its part, moved quickly to lock in the gain, scrapping the 2003 treaty that had governed shared use of the sea and the Kerch Strait, a treaty Putin himself had signed decades earlier, when he was still trying to present Russia as a reliable international partner. With that agreement gone, Russian officials began calling the Azov internal waters, off-limits to Ukrainian shipping entirely, and started funneling serious money into infrastructure there. Russia has directed roughly $12 billion in federal development funding into the 4 occupied Ukrainian regions since 2024, several times what comparable Russian federal regions received under similar programs, money explicitly framed as building a durable, permanent Russian presence rather than a temporary wartime occupation. That was the status quo until the 6th of July, when Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces launched what they've called Operation Maloshka. The name translates roughly to dairy or little milk, and it has nothing to do with the sea's contents and everything to do with the operation's stated aim of turning enemy ships into inert, drifting hulks. Within about 2 weeks, Ukrainian officials say the campaign had struck somewhere north of 150 vessels across the Azov and the Black Sea combined, expanding from the shallow Azov feeder routes into deeper Black Sea shipping lanes by the middle of July. It's worth flagging plainly that these are Ukrainian military claims reported through Ukraine's own Unmanned Systems Forces and its commander, Robert Brovdy, and that neither the individual vessels struck nor the extent of the damage has been independently verified by outside observers, since Russia has largely declined to comment on the losses. That doesn't mean the claims are false. The pattern of daily detailed strike reports, satellite imagery of fires at targets like the port of Kerch, and independent Ukrainian and Western reporting on reduced Russian shipping activity in the Azov all point toward a real and significant campaign, but it does mean the specific tallies should be read as one side's account of its own success, rather than a confirmed external body count. What makes the campaign strategically interesting isn't really about sinking ships for the sake of sinking them. According to Brovdy, the deliberate goal is to avoid causing environmental disasters by rupturing hulls and spilling oil, and instead to disable engines, navigation, and communications, so that each vessel becomes what he's described as a blind, deaf drifting barge rather than a functioning ship. The primary targets are the small and medium feeder tankers that move oil from Russian terminals through the Volga-Don Canal system to larger vessels waiting further out, the ones that ultimately carry Russian oil to international markets despite sanctions. Analysts have noted it typically takes over a dozen of these feeder runs to fill one larger ocean-going tanker, so every feeder taken offline for repairs measurably slows how fast Russia can move oil out the door and get paid for it. Dry cargo ships, ferries, and tugboats have been hit too, each one degrading a different piece of the logistics chain that keeps both commercial shipping and Crimea's military supply lines functioning. None of this happened in a vacuum. Ukraine spent roughly 2 years setting the conditions that made this campaign possible, largely by forcing Russia's Black Sea fleet to retreat from Crimean waters through a sustained campaign of missile and naval drone strikes earlier in the war, and by steadily grinding down the air defense network protecting the peninsula. Drones and missiles still have to cross Crimean airspace to reach Azov targets, but a meaningful share of the air defense systems that used to intercept them have either been destroyed or pulled back toward Moscow and St. Petersburg to protect more politically sensitive targets, leaving what remains stretched thin protecting priorities like the Kerch Bridge over the shipping lanes themselves. The International Institute for the Study of War and independent Ukrainian security analysts have generally framed this campaign as the newest phase of a longer-running effort to isolate Crimea from Russia's broader logistics network, rather than as direct preparation for a ground offensive to retake the peninsula. That distinction matters because retaking Crimea by force anytime soon remains genuinely unlikely. Only 2 land routes connect the peninsula to the outside world: a narrow isthmus a few kilometers wide, linking it to mainland Ukraine, heavily mined and fortified after years of Russian engineering work, and the Kerch Bridge connecting it directly to Russia, and any force trying to fight its way across either would be attacking into some of the most heavily defended terrain in the entire war. What the Azov and Black Sea campaign can realistically achieve is something narrower but still meaningful, making Crimea steadily more expensive and more miserable for Russia to hold, disrupting the fuel and fuel supply lines that keep the peninsula's economy and its garrison functioning, and undercutting the basic pitch Moscow made to Crimeans back in 2014 that life under Russian rule would be more stable and more prosperous than life under Kyiv. That pitch looks considerably weaker now that Crimean authorities have had to declare states of emergency over power outages and fuel shortages triggered by Ukrainian strikes. There's also a broader economic backdrop that makes the timing of this campaign more significant than it might otherwise be. Independent reporting has pointed to Russian crude processing rates falling to their lowest levels in over 2 decades, driven partly by direct strikes on refineries and partly by the disruption to shipping logistics this campaign adds on top of that. Russia's own economic ministry has reported growth slowing to a crawl through the first months of this year, with some indicators suggesting the economy may already be tipping into outright contraction, while inflation has been accelerating month over month. Those are numbers coming from Russian officials themselves, which usually means the underlying reality is at least as bad, if not worse. None of this means Russia is on the verge of economic collapse, and it would be a mistake to read a few weeks of successful drone strikes as evidence that Vladimir Putin is close to reconsidering the war. If anything, the pattern over the past few years has been that battlefield or economic setbacks tend to make Russian strikes on Ukraine more intense, not less, as Moscow looks for ways to project strength domestically, even while its own economic position erodes. It's worth resisting the temptation to read too much symbolic meaning into which targets Ukraine chooses not to hit, though it's a pattern that's held up consistently. Kyiv notably declined to strike Russia's Victory Day parade in Moscow this past May, despite issuing threats beforehand, and reportedly avoided directly hitting the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, even while demonstrating through nearby strikes that it had the reach to do so if it chose to. Whether that restraint reflects strategic calculation about not escalating past certain thresholds, concern about international reaction, or simply a judgment that degrading Russia's logistics and economy quietly is more valuable than a single dramatic strike, is something reasonable analysts disagree about, and it's not something that can be settled definitively from the outside. All of this is unfolding against the backdrop of real turbulence inside Ukraine's own political and military leadership, with President Zelensky's recent removal of Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov triggering days of street protests and open criticism from military reformers over the direction of the war effort. It's genuinely too early to know how much that domestic upheaval will affect operations like this one. Ukraine's drone and unmanned systems capability has been built up over years by a wide network of military units, volunteer organizations, and private sector partnerships that extend well beyond any single official. And that institutional depth is precisely what's allowed a campaign like this one to keep running and expanding even in the middle of a genuine political crisis in Kyiv. Whether that resilience holds if the turmoil around Fedorov's removal deepens, or whether the loss of his particular relationships and reform push eventually shows up in slower innovation down the line, is something that will only become clear with time, not something that can be read off the current pace of strikes in the Azov. For now, the more grounded way to read this moment is as a genuine tactical success, sitting inside a much longer, much less certain strategic picture. Ukraine has found a way to impose real, measurable costs on Russia's shadow fleet and its Crimean logistics using cheap, expendable drones against expensive, hard-to-replace ships and infrastructure at a fraction of the cost Russia now has to spend on repairs, rerouted supply chains, and stretched air defenses. That is exactly the kind of asymmetric trade that a smaller power fighting a larger one needs to keep finding if it wants to avoid a war of pure attrition it cannot win. But a campaign like this one wins slowly, through accumulated pressure over months and years, not through any single dramatic headline, and it will only matter in the end if Ukraine can sustain it alongside everything else it's simultaneously trying to hold together. Its front lines, its economy, its Western support, and right now, its own internal political cohesion. At last, to all my dear friends, stay ahead of the curve and hit subscribe to be part of the adventure.